Hi, and welcome to the Trucking History Channel. Here's some tidbits of information from 1920. It does have to do with trucking history in a more general and broad sense of the word. It was an article entitled Automobile History is One of Amazement. And I remember this was early in 1920, okay? Keep that in mind. 90 makers of passenger cars and 170 builders of motor trucks in 32 states. Think about that. There was 170 different companies making trucks back in 1920. Now they produced 1.5 million passenger cars. And get this, 305,142 trucks. More than half of the 30 million tires made in 1919 were from a small group of manufacturers. We're probably talking Firestone, Goodyear. There was another big one based in Akron. I can't think of the name of it right now, but there were probably just 3 or 4 large tire manufacturers, but they made half of the 30 million tires made in 1919. The other half was made by 213 smaller companies. Now, it was impressive enough to hear that there was 170 makers of trucks back then. But now we see there's 213 makers of tires for all those 1.5 million passenger cars and 305,000 trucks. It's amazing how many small companies there were back in the 20s. Now, this was in the early days of cars and trucks. So there was a lot of small manufacturers, and through the years they all consolidated. Some of them went out of business, but generally the bigger companies bought out the smaller ones, and it ended up with what it is today, just a handful of tire makers in this country. Okay. Goodyear Tire and Rubber made nearly 7 million tires in 1919, and that was 20% of the total. And they were estimated to make 40 million in 1920, just a year later, and that would have been 25% of the market. So they went from 7 million to 40 million in 1 year. That's impressive. Check this out. In 1919, there were 62,000 automobile dealers, garages, or repair shops. That's everything combined together. Of that, 32,317 were car dealers, in every town, every city, whatever. 18,943 were dealers in trucks. So you had 18,943 dealers selling trucks made from 170 makers of trucks. There was 36,427 garages and 43,381 repair shops. Now keep in mind, this is still 1919 we're talking about. We're not talking about big multi-bay repair shops. We're talking about a lot of single bay, maybe 2 bays of repair shops for the size of cars that were back in 1919. Small. Think small. Think Model Ts, maybe the next generation, but they were small. Get this. Farmers were the large users of motor trucks, owning 10% of the total truck number more than manufacturers and 15% more than the retailers. Now, back in the early days, when trucks first got started, retailers used trucks to deliver to the customers or from the warehouses to all the individual stores. And back in 1919, there were some chains that were pretty big. Think A&P food stores. Think Woolworths. Think Kresge. Those type. So uh, those are the type of trucks that were used in the early days. Also being used in the early days was delivery of beer. Trucks were used to deliver beer early on. But farmers had the biggest use because they had to get from the farm to the market or to the railroad depot to ship their goods out. So they were an early adopter of trucks. This is where it gets good. In 1919, 36 million horses were displaced by trucks. Now remember, I've talked about this several times. Before trucks, there was what was called horse and wagon teams, and they were driven by teamsters. That's how the Teamsters Union got their name, because they unionized the wagon teams, and then as the world progressed into trucks, they just naturally followed in with the trucking industry. But 36 million horses were displaced by trucks in 1919. In my research, I have found several instances of, in the early days around 1919, 1920, even back into the late 20s, there were still horse liveries and there was trucks at the same time. I'm doing research on early trucking in Chicago. Excuse me. And in the early Chicago trucking industry, there was a lot of transportation companies called like Central Teaming or Chicago Teaming Company or whatever, or Smith Teaming, whatever. And they were using the horse-drawn wagons. Now, as they went into trucks, some of them kept the teaming name, but it didn't last long. By the time all the horses were gone, they couldn't call themselves teaming companies anymore. So, that word in trucking history went away, just like regulation. Speaking of horses, now this is an interesting fact I found out about. Speaking of horses, horses would soon be banished from Denver, Colorado streets on January 1st of 1925 if a bill that was already in front of City Council became law. We're talking Denver. We're talking 1925. They're going to get away with all the horses and go solely with trucks, railroads, things like that. That to me is interesting, and I found that along with this other information that I'm giving tonight. So that's our episode for today on trucking history. Hope you enjoyed it. Look for the next one. See ya.